it's probably time. So today I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about managing an engineering schedule. So who am I? I'm Anthea Watson-Strong. And right now my role is as a TPM in search at Google. So basically what that means is product managers decide what it is that we're going to do, what it is that we're going to build on my team. And my job is to make sure that we build that thing and that we build it on time. And so I am deeply and intimately involved in engineering schedules, in particular because the kinds of products that I build, that my team builds, are election products. So I can demo these really quickly for you. So this right here is called a one box, and this is what my team builds. It's the Republican delegates, the Democratic delegates, and there's sort of a schedule of upcoming elections. And then on the night of an election, the election results will come in live. So they stream through to our product, and you'll see these numbers ticking. So that interesting things about my job is that the election dates don't move. So Google is very much a quality-driven organizations. They tend to do things until they are right and then launch them. But that doesn't work when you're working on elections, because if you do that, you have the potential of launching 2 weeks after the election has already happened. And it turns out that election results 2 weeks after the election has happened are not useful to anyone. So my role is to fight this sort of entropy that results from working at Google and our processes as they're setting up at Google, as they're set up at Google. So what I'm going to talk about right now is sometimes referred to as waterfall project management or classical project management. This is the kind of project management that I practice with my team. It has a really bad rep these days. Lots of folks are all about Agile, all about Scrum. You'll hear those sort of words tossed around a little bit. And they sort of frown upon waterfall classical project management techniques. The reason that my team and I have chosen to do sort of more of the classical start, plan, execute, finish way of doing things is because of these hard deadlines and the fact that we can't be wrong ever, because if we're wrong by 2 or 3 weeks, then everything is for naught. And this sort of lineal nature is actually really helpful to us. That being said, that doesn't necessarily mean, I think there's sort of this myth out there that if you're practicing classical project management, it means that you can never go back to any of the other phrases, or like, if these projects can't be, you can't do sort of iterative design in them or anything like that. And I disagree. We've managed to incorporate a lot of the Agile sort of benefits into our project management linear phase. And I'll talk a little bit about how we've done that in each of the remaining signs, in each of the phases that I talk about. The other sort of characteristic about waterfall is there's often sort of a gate between each of the phases. So there's sort of a start, and then there's a plan, and execute, and finish. And in each one of those points, there's sort of a meeting or a sign off or an approval process or something that you have to go through that takes you from one of these phases to the other. One of the things about Scrum is the requirements and the research around an Agile. The requirements phase is sort of built into all of the rest of the schedule. For classical project management, you generally document your requirements early. So one of the nice things about this method is if you already know what it is that you need, then it can be very helpful. If you aren't really sure what you're building or what the needs are for the product, then this is like not the way you should be building projects at all. For my products in particular, the election products, we know how election works. We know the kinds of things that users are going to want to know about election results at the beginning of the project. We're not creating a new yik yak. So we're able to do this in a way that it wouldn't work if we were starting something from scratch that didn't exist yet, and we didn't even really understand what it was that we were going to build. So just sort of reviewing, when waterfall is right tends to be when the goals are known, The solution is already established. Execution is going to be pretty standard. It's important to get the project right the first time. You don't have time to go back and try again. Or if it is impossible to have your client involved in the entire process. I don't have that particular problem. My client is Google. Google is, of course, involved in every step of this process. But if you're at an outside agency, or if you're working in an environment where you can't be talking all the time to your client, then classical is probably your better bet. So this is sort of the general way that I think about our project plans. So there's sort of the starting phase, the planning phase, executing, and finishing. And each section of my presentation here will address each one of these. Starting the project. So this actually sounds easier than it actually is. Often I think of this phase as being like the total shit show. So somebody has decided, or there are a bunch of people who've decided that we're going to do something, but everybody's idea about what it is that we're going to be doing is totally different. Often people aren't talking to each other. Often, you end up with sometimes even different teams sort of starting to do the same thing. Nobody really knows when it's going to be done. Nobody really knows what we're going to be measured by. There's just sort of this energy that's starting to form. There are people who talk about this as being the storming part of the project. There tends to be a lot of feelings involved, and there tends to be a lot of sort of bumping into each other and trying to, nobody's sort of going the same direction anymore. So my role as a TPM here tends to involve trying to help people sort of get to the point where they're all facing at least in the same direction. And those sort of tasks tend to fall into convincing everyone to determine sort of the big goals and writing those down and establishing what it is exactly we're doing and what, not sort of precisely in a fine-grained way, but sort of the big picture, what are we doing and what are we not doing is really important here. Understanding like how much money we have, how much headcount we have, that sort of resource questions. And then figuring out who are the people who are going to be approving this, who are the people who are big stakeholders, why is it that suddenly everybody in the organization has started thinking about like, oh, we need to get this done. Just a quick note about SMART goals. So this is actually a term that was invented by Peter Drucker, who's, if you haven't read any of his books, he's sort of a very famous management consultant from like the 60s, the 50s and 60s. And The Practice of Management is his big book, and I recommend it if you ever want to read it. It's the kind of thing that you get assigned as a business administration undergraduate. So he talks about goals being specific, measurable, assignable, realistic, and time-driven. At Google, we actually use a different sort of acronym. Ours are called OKRs. They're objectives and key results. So our OKRs, there's actually a video I'll send out. I'm going to send out a ton of links to you guys after this is over, but there's a video where you can see how Google goes about setting our OKRs. But examples, so an OKR that I had earlier this year was exit the quarter with ready to launch election products for US primaries, including results one box and expanded candidate KPs. So that basically meant like build and launch my products. And that's specific, it's measurable. It was really clear who was supposed to be doing it. It was realistic, it was time related. Other kinds of OKRs we tend to have is increase product usage, daily active users by X%, or a get approved plan, an exec sign off for doing X, Y, or Z, something like that. So they're all sort of very concrete, and it's very clear what it is that we're doing and who's responsible for doing it. I mentioned SMART goals in this particular part of the presentation because although it's good to be thinking about all of the SMART sort of goal thing all throughout this entire process, this tends to be the place where people are most tempted to write docs that involve like high-flying pie-in-the-sky thinking, which is super annoying. So I'm going to fix, the world, or I'm going to invent a time machine, or whatever it is, right? Or they write really vague things like, we're going to make things better. you know, and it's like, okay, well, how are you going to make things better? Like, what are you going to measure to ensure that you know things are better? When are you going to make them better by? Sort of, these are all the kinds of questions that somebody who's managing an engineering schedule needs to ask at the beginning of a project. This is also this sort of part of the project where I consider, like, so normally when I'm running a project, there's sort of what I'm actually publicly saying, and then there are things that I am not saying publicly. And this particular diagram is kind of the way I think through things that I'm not necessarily acknowledging. There tends to be a lot of small p political sort of machinations, especially at the beginning of something, right? People have their own private agendas, or they have public agendas, and it's not clear who's going to be controlling what in these kind of situations. And generally, the more sort of small p political stuff that's going on, the worse it is for the project. So I try really hard, or I consider part of my job, or part of the most important part of my job at this point, is to be reducing the amount of uncertainty and political machinations that are going on. So I am trying to figure out and then establish things like who has the requirements authority, who has the design authority, and who has the technical authority, who has the budget and headcount authority, and like what is the review process going to be. So instead of it being really unclear who's in charge, I want to make sure that it becomes, that we have the discussion about who's in charge and who gets to make decisions, and then write that down. And once it's written down, anyone else who tries to come and make waves, we can refer them to the document and say, okay, well, we had a conversation, and this is what we've decided in terms of who has the ownership over making certain decisions. Generally, there are sort of three buckets of people who are competing for authority over a project. One is sort of the business of but I know from talking to other product managers and project managers and program managers in other tech companies, sometimes the business analysts will have a lot of say over what is being built or what is not being built. And then there's sort of the tech bucket, which is generally the engineer managers or the tech leads. And then the user bucket are the product managers, the user designers, user experience designers, user experience researchers. And the three of those groups generally will have some say over what it is that you're building, or how it is that you're going to be building it. And negotiating these sort of three nodes of power is part of your job, and getting them to all agree and start pointing in the same direction. One of the sort of ways you can figure out who's actually got the power is looking at sort of just the numbers. So in your company at large, do engineers outnumber business analysts? Then you're probably going to have engineers being a stronger stakeholder. Here at Google, product managers have a lot of say, but generally, if push comes to shove, well, that's interesting. It really depends, but I try and know beforehand who's going to be the one who wins if there's a conflict between two big buckets of people over what it is that we should be doing. So that's all sort of very impractical. Where's my dashboard? I want to see if you guys have questions. Nobody has said that they have questions. You guys can chat me if you have questions, right? I think you can. Or email me. I'll start checking my email regularly to see what it is that people are emailing me. No one has emailed me any questions. Okay. So that's sort of very impractical, vague advice. So I want to be really concrete about what you could do at the beginning. And my to-do list generally involves, ooh, I've got a question. Do I? Denise is saying, yes, you can see the questions. So I'm going to, there's only 2 of you now, so if you have questions, so Denise and somebody, oh, now there's 4 people, maybe. Anyway, so back to this. So these are the kinds of things that are on my to-do list when we're starting out on a project. So I meet with eng management and product managers. Often email distribution lists is like something no one else has done yet, and it's very helpful. Also bonus, you often get to create the secret code name for the project if you're the one who puts the email distribution list together, which is one of my favorite things to do. And then you're going to start your draft documentation. So I have included in this presentation lots of templates, things that I there's sort of adjusted versions of what it is that I use for each different phase of the project. So you can see this is a very basic project template brief. This would be for a very small project rather than a very complicated one, but it gives you a sense of what it is that you're trying to figure out in this beginning phase. Informal 101. So I try really hard to meet with everybody, like the most junior engineer to the most senior engineer. Sometimes if you've got 150 people on a project, it's not possible, but really, for the first, if we're doing a project that's, more than a couple quarters long, the first couple weeks, all I'm doing is half-an-hour coffees with folks. You get a really great sense of what's happening with the project if you know everybody and sort of have informal relationships with everybody. And that's especially true of the engineers. So I try to know every engineer by name, and I try and have really good relationships, because the sort of informal feedback you'll get from sort of individual contributors who are just on the line, sort of banging things out, is way more valuable than what you'll get from like a high-level exec. I've seen a lot of folks make this mistake, be more concerned about sort of leadership than the engineers, and that's just going to get you in trouble. This is also sort of the time when you're going to be thinking about budget and headcount and those sorts of things. Getting exec sign-off or support, it's amazing how often people want to skip this step, but it often will not be good if you surprise execs. So figuring out, okay, who's going to be asking for approval? Often I'm not the person who goes in to meet with a VP of product and pitch them on our plan, but trying to help people make the decisions about who's going to be the sort of public face for this project, who needs to be in the meeting, that kind of thing. Communicating out, we need to announce the project. So every step of the way, you're going to do a bunch of things, and then you're going to spend a lot of time communicating. And communicating is probably the most important part of your job. The announcement email will, one, give you transparency to the rest of the organization, and two, you'll start to get pings and emails with people being like, oh, have you thought about this? Or like, I see a problem here, there, or the other. And it's good to begin to collect all of that. And without sort of a general broad announcement, sometimes people don't even know what it is that you're doing. Next phase is planning the project. So sort of at a high level, you're looking to break those sort of high level objectives that you've got into milestones, and figuring out who's going to be working on the team, create a timeline. And right now is when you're going to be thinking, okay, instead of being optimistic and like, oh yes, we can do everything, you're going to start to be like, okay, where are things going to go wrong? What's the likelihood of them going wrong? So this is my project timeline template. This is for a fairly complex project. I think this template was pulled from a project where I'm working with 30 different engineers. And you can see this was my timeline for the design phase when we were figuring out what it is that we were going to do. And you can see all of it's basically the product, task, owner, due date, whether it was delivered. There's a link here to whatever was delivered and some notes. There's the key up top with blocked, slipping, on track, and complete. And then what it is that we're doing as you scroll down. So that's product 1, and then product 2 is a little bit less complicated. So that's sort of tab 1, and then this is how I'll break out the engineering teams. So at the top, we've got major work streams. Each of these little rows represents a week in the year. So it goes from 12/21 through 12/26 of the end of this year. And these red rows are the things that we're going to be building. So you can see sort of feature 1 should be built, from just after Christmas, and then launch 125, or that week, the week of 125, and so forth. So you can see what we're going to be working on when. This is just a basic Gantt chart. And then you can see as you scroll down what individual contributors are working on. So we've got a PM here who's working on the design, and it's color-coded UX, product, and eng design. And then the different features here when they're going to be built. These pink dates are my sort of important dates. they're not end dates, they're sort of like real world dates, right? So you can probably guess what these mean. This is the week of the convention, so this is an important week for us, my elections team, or this is the election day, so you can see it's an important one for our team. I like this way of visualizing our work because I can scroll down and see for any, this would normally be like a list of names, and I can scroll down and see for any given week, what is, engineer, what is Jacqueline Coleman, one of our engineers, working on? Oh, she's working on feature 2. I can also begin to see where we've got things stacked up, where we need to have, oh, if we're going to get feature 4 done by 6/13, then we need to start this design, and then I'll start scheduling all out and discover that, like, we've got 7 engineers needed for feature 4, but we've only got 3 on the team, and so I'm going to have to go and hire some more, get some more headcount or whatever it is. So this is sort of a handy dandy template. So these two down, product 1 and product 2 are engineering schedules. You can see product 2, I think, is a little bit less complicated. Also the other key here is I've got front end and back end as different colors. And these dark weeks are weeks when we're not working. So Google gives us 2 days off for July 4th. I'm assuming that almost everybody on the team will be taking at least a couple of days extra. And so we'll get very little work then done. This week here on 10/17 is like our entire product area, all of search goes on an offsite in the middle of October. And so we're probably going to get very little work done then. So I schedule those out to make sure that we're not including those in our estimates of when we're going to get work done. This is what my non-eng Gantt charts look like. So engineers, we break everything down into weeks. Everything else, we break it down into months. It's a lot less important that we're accurate on a week-by-week basis for non-eng. And so this is what it looks like. Very similar though, because I want to be able to see as I scan through all the tabs exactly, I want to be in the sort of same part of the spreadsheet for where things are. This is an alternative way of looking at something. So I included it here in case you guys wanted a different way of presenting the same information. So this is my old way of looking at the design phase, and it has all of the steps that we go through for our design phase. And then for each of the products, there's different dates. So I found this didn't work for us because we didn't end up having, I thought we would have a very standard way of getting from, nothing to design finished, but it turned out that, so each product would just go through all of those steps. But it turned out that every product wasn't going through all those steps. And sometimes the products were going through them in different order. So this view ended up being totally bad for the way we wanted to track work, but it is, I think, a really clean way of presenting work when you've got a standard way of doing things every time. So I included it here in case you guys wanted to look at it. Yes, so that's a timeline and identifying risks. So I tend to be the first one who looks at, for example, something like this and says, oh, it turns out we have plans to do 7 features. And I've gone around and gotten rough estimates from engineers about how long it's going to take to do all of these things. And, if given the number of engineers that we have, we're not going to be done until May of 2017. And the elections are in November of 2016. Like, this is a problem. So this is the phase when I tend to start talking about risks, talking about whether or not we're going to be able to do what it is everybody's dreaming of doing. Yes. Yeah. So this is how at Google we go from nothing to sort of the planning being done. We start off with user experience research. So this is ongoing really, but generally before we start a project, the folks who have been doing the research for us as in an ongoing way will generate some sort of set of requirements for us that says, hey, this is what users are looking for in the elections readout or whatever it is. That gets turned into a set of UI designs and product requirements docs. So the UI is the sort of a visual interpretation of what it is that we want to build, and the product requirements doc is a written version of what it is that we're going to be building. That gets turned into design docs. The engineers will write front end and back end design docs, and sometimes there'll be more too. And then that gets handed to me, and I create what's called a work breakdown, which is a very fine-grained way of tracking from day to day all of the tasks. So instead of being like week-long tasks or month-long tasks, it's sort of even finer than that. The important part to note here is we really try and make sure that all of this is iterative. So the first draft of user experience research is sort of done as it's being finished. A first draft gets produced, and then the product requirements doc starts. And it generally, as the designer and the product manager are sort of doing their work, they generate a whole bunch of questions that then go back to the user experience researcher to answer. And that's true all the way down the line. It's not until sort of the next step starts to happen that those folks realize, oh, I have a million questions I haven't gotten answered by the previous step that I need answered. We see this most in this product requirements to design docs sort of shift. So generally, once the UI and the product requirements doc is done, everybody's like, oh, it looks beautiful. This is awesome. We love it. And then the engineers start writing their design docs, and they're like, oh, well, where are we going to get those photos? Or how are we going to order this? Or you say you only want swing states. What counts as a swing state? Those are the kinds of questions that sort of pop up in the design doc phase. And so then the product manager has to go back and include all of that new information and answers to all the questions that are being generated by the design docs in the PRD. So I think also something to think about on this slide is the most important part of the process that somebody who's managing the schedule plays is making sure that they understand who is playing what role. Like who is the owner of writing the PRD, who is the owner of writing the design docs, and who has the authority to approve those things, and how will decisions get made. So I'm constantly thinking about that, the sort of process question. It's really easy to get sucked into the conversations. It's like, is this the right thing to be building right now? If you're the product manager while you're running the engineering schedule, then yes, you should also be thinking about that. But if you're not the product manager, or if you can sort of, if it's possible to have a role that's separate from this, having somebody who's just thinking about the process right here can be very, very helpful. And I actively prevent myself from trying to think about what it is that we should be building in this process, because there's a lot of people thinking about that. I'm thinking exclusively on how we're going to get from nothing to product plans as quickly as possible. The other thing I recommend is everybody should know what the intermediary points are, right? So if you go back to my tracker, this design phase one, everybody knows we're going to do a user experience research, and then we're going to do initial mocks, and then Eng investigation begins, and Eng feedback from that investigation has to go back to product at this time, right? So we sat down with the entire team at the beginning of this process and explained what it is the checkpoints were in the process. I also advocate for more frequent, less formal meetings. So there tends to be sort of set in the calendar. You'll see there are a couple of these in here, like where it's a good one. Oh, this is one here, V2 mock and PRD review with Eng team, right? So there are big meetings that are sort of our linchpins here. And those are sort of, they're put there as a way of holding all of our feet to the fire and making sure that we don't slip. But at the same time, I'm encouraging the product manager to set up, daily meetings with the tech lead to review the work that he's made on the PRD every day. He also has office hours so that anybody can walk into his office and ask questions on what it is that we're doing as the Eng investigation is going on. And these sort of frequent meetings that are informal tend to be where most of the work happens. And by the time we get to these big meetings, unless something's gone really, really badly, it tends to be a rubber stamp meeting. Yeah. going back to the slide. So team roles. In my past jobs, this has been more of a problem than it is in Google, but this can be a very helpful way of making sure people understand what it is that they are responsible for and what it is that they're not responsible for or they don't have power over. I use this kind of, there's a doc that I use here. So I use this kind of doc when everybody thinks that they're in charge or the boss, when you've got like a million bosses running around and not enough workers. So in that case, I try really hard to write out all of the tasks, and then the owner is the person who's actually going to do the work. They might not do all of the work. They might have a helper who assists with some of the work, but they're the ones who like make sure it gets done. Accountable is the person who signs off on decisions. This isn't always a boss, but often it's like sort of the executive person. It's whoever you have to seek approval for to move forward. And then consultants are people who don't actually have power over the decisions or the work, but you should be bringing them in and asking them for their advice along the way. But they don't get to say yes or no. RAID is also an interesting way of starting to evaluate whether or not your project is going to be successful or not. I send out reports weekly. One of them is sort of a generic weekly report, and I'll show you my template for that. One of them I send only to eng managers who are working on my project. It's an internal report that I call my RAID log. And in it, I'm identifying these things, risks, assumptions, issues, dependencies. So the examples would be, a risk would be, for example, this week, one of the data providers we thought we were licensing data from has decided to back out of negotiations. So we're not getting data from this particular person. We think we're going to be able to replace it through another provider, but we don't know. That's a risk, right? Because if we can't get the data, then our product's not going to work. Assumptions are things like, we are assuming that we don't need to do X, Y, and Z, or what's a good one? I can't think of a good one right now, but there are things that it's not a risk because you have no evidence that you're not going to get this, but it is an assumption that something will happen. I guess a good one for us for elections was, we designed our products assuming that there were going to be 2 major party candidates for the general election. I didn't think that was going to have to be a stated assumption until recently. But if a third party candidate jumps in and starts winning states for the general election, our product designs wouldn't necessarily work. So it's a good one. Issues, these tend to be lower importance than risks. So this might be something like, oh, we've got an engineer who's announced that he's leaving to go work on another project, and we need to backfill his job. And we've got several candidates, but the leading candidate, she can't start for another 4 weeks. So we've got these 4 weeks of work, that dead zone, like what are we going to do about it? Dependencies is something that I spend a lot of time managing, and that will be, in my work in particular, it's like other parts of search that, infrastructure in particular, that needs to be finished in order for our products to work. So there's a lot of stuff that we don't build ourselves that other teams are building that we have to plug into, and they don't necessarily care about our deadlines as much as we do. And if they delay or they don't hit their deadlines in the way that we need them to, then it could be that we can't launch because our product can't work without whatever it is that they're building. This is again, I would never write this down, but it's something I think a lot about. Especially if you've got small p politics playing around, trying to figure out who to spend your time on and who to ignore. It's helpful to think about this sort of matrix. Really, it's if you've got the quadrant where project support is low, but impact on project is high, that's where you really need to be focusing your manpower. and trying to make sure that they're getting on board. So we talked a little bit about the project planning tricks and documenting team roles. This is also when I start conducting one-on-ones with all team members. I don't have regular one-on-ones with everybody all the time, but I do make sure at the beginning of a project that I've met for half an hour with everybody. This is an example of a RAID log that I've used. So this is way zoomed out. Oh yeah, I zoomed out for the other thing. So drop downs and things like these. This can be a helpful report to send out or something to use when you've got a ton of different things that are impacting your project. Decision logs, I love decision logs. I'm going to talk about them in a little bit. But this is a good time to start that. So again, the last part of a phase is generally communicating. Circulating project plan is a good way of getting comments and getting feedbacks and identifying dependencies you hadn't identified before. A lot of times when I circulate the project plan, I get pings from other parts of the company saying like, oh, have you thought about this? Or, oh, like it turns out that that's getting deprecated and it's not gonna work, that kind of thing. This is my weekly report template I included. So I start sending these out. This is the sort of overall product list when we're supposed to be complete. And then there's just a very simple, this is designed for execs to be able to scan through and say like on track, off track, and then focus on the red if they want to focus on the red. So this product list would be mostly Eng work. This is the product manager and UX UER work. And then generally there's like 4 or 5 other groups that I'm working with for various reasons. And so this is where they would be listed. And then I have the leads for each of those groups give sort of 1-line updates, 1 or 2-line updates on things and upcoming milestones at the bottom. It's a really simple project report, but I've found that it would be very helpful in keeping people up to date on what's going on. The other thing I'm going to pitch, and throughout this presentation, I'm talking a lot about Google products. That's because I'm required to use Google products at work. There are non-Google versions of everything that I'm showing you, and even like sort of project management specific versions of this. So like if you want, instead of a project track, instead of creating something like this one with spreadsheets like I do, there are like Gantt chart software that can do this for you automatically. The upside of using software that automatically does this for you is you can spend a lot less time formatting spreadsheets. I will probably always stick to using spreadsheets because I like to sort of know in my bones what's going on. And if I'm required to go in and update rather than things like sort of automatically updating, then I have a much better sense of like how things are flowing. So that's my pitch for doing things in spreadsheets rather than using those like fancy tools. But fancy tools are good in their place too. Anyway, so Google Sites is what I use for all of my sort of project documentation stuff. So like I keep a major calendar as like the front page of on our site, and then you can access each, there's tabs for each of the products we're working on and our long-term planning, and then archives for all of our historical products. And under each tab, you can find our user experience research, our mocks, the latest ones, the latest PRD, the latest work breakdown chart. You can find links to email lists, information on who's on call. You can find, what else can you find? You can see press clippings. You can basically, like anytime anyone pings me and says like, hey, where is X? If it's not already in normally I'm like, oh, it's on the site, and I send them a link to the site. If it's not already on the site, then I go and add it to the site because it's probably something other people are looking for too. And I want one central repository of everything that you would need in order to understand exactly what it is that we're doing. So executing the project, how are we doing? I'm gonna see, I've still got 3 viewers. I like the 3 of you. I hope you don't have me sort of on the background. Oh, there's 4 viewers. It's very unclear how many people are watching this. Yes, so executing the project. The big sort of picture, tracking the progress, making good decisions and communicating. So how to talk about these things. Tracking the progress, as I talked about a little bit earlier just now, there are a million tools designed to help you track end progress, project progress, whatever it is. And in general, my philosophy is use the tool that works for the team. So I have my favorites. I just explained why I love spreadsheets, but in my one-on-ones with engineers, one of the things that I am always asking is, how was the last project you worked on? What was good? What was bad? What did you use to track your progress? Did you like it? Why did you like it? Why didn't you like it? Engineers often will there'll be like zero agreement on what it is that we should be doing. In fact, you can have like epic long email threads about which kind of tool should be used to track end progress. I generally will facilitate some sort of discussion, make sure that the tech leads have decision-making authority so we at least can get a decision at some point, and then work with them to pick the tool once we've got input from the entire team. The other thing I will say is I generally think of tracking progress as happening in sort of the very big picture, the sort of medium-sized kind of picture, and the small size. And generally, those three kinds of tracking happen in three different places. So you can see this time, generally, it all sort of falls into place in different points too, right? First, you do the big picture timeline like this, right? And then once you're done with that, there's some sort of work breakdown structure or JIRA or something like that gets set up that's is about medium-sized tasks. And then at the very end, or at end of the spectrum, you start managing bug lists. We use a tool called Buganizer internally. So those are sort of the three kinds of tracking things. And often I have all three open in a window and I'm flipping backwards and forwards between the three. Let's see what else. Gotta flip back to I've got so many windows open, you guys. Okay, this is what I need to do. Here we go. Okay. So a little bit of a note about decisions. One of the most important roles you can play at this in the sort of executing the project phase is figuring out how to make decisions well. I think these sort of fall into a few categories. First, you have to figure out like what's at stake, and document what's at stake, and to think that through. One, I try and figure out what exactly is the conflict or the decision all about. Like, why are we making this decision? One of the big things is what happens if you're wrong? How important is it for you to be right? If you get it wrong, does everything fall apart, or are things probably going to be okay? One of the things to focus on that often nobody else is focusing on is when do we need to make this decision by? So you are probably the only one who understands the schedule in the kind of fine-grained detail that needs to be, in which it needs to be understood in order to make sure that you hit your deadlines in time. And so you're the one who's going to know, oh, here's our window of opportunity. If we don't make this decision in by 2 weeks, then that means the contracts don't get, if this is a budget question, for example, like should we allocate an additional, X number of dollars to the project, then you're the one who knows, oh, if the budget isn't allocated by X time, that means that the legal team won't have time to review the contracts and get them executed, which means we'll get the data late, which means that the engineers will have to work on ingestion late, which means we'll launch late, right? You're the only one who's going to really know that. So keeping a real keen eye on that sort of window of opportunity. I think you're also very well placed to be the person who's asking the question, who makes the decision and how do we escalate if it's more than one person who is making the decision. So if the product manager and the eng lead are disagreeing about what should be done over a particular feature, you can facilitate, you can have them sit down, you can help them weigh options and all of those sorts of things. But ultimately, you should have in your head what happens if they can't disagree, they can't decide or come to a consensus, because you're going to be the one who probably initiates that escalation. So once you've got sort of what's at stake down, thinking about finding and weighing the options. So the kinds of things that I tend to do is if it's a big enough decision, I'll start with a team brainstorm, like everyone coming in, we'll do a problem brief, and then we'll just go around and everybody will get a chance to talk about what it is that they think the right solution is, and we'll come up with new solutions. We'll whiteboard. Once we've got a set of potential solutions to the problem, I'll write them up and circulate for comment. So again, this will give people who didn't attend the meeting or for whatever reason want to think through the, in the meeting we're advocating for their own particular solution, and now that we've narrowed it down to 3 solutions, give them a chance to talk about what it is that they think should happen. You want to consult with experts who's done this before, who's made this kind of decision before. And finally, convening the decision makers and making sure that we make a decision and that decision is circulated out. Which brings me to my favorite of all the templates I'm going to show you. This is my decision log. So it's broken right now. So don't go in and make a copy of it now, but it won't be broken soon. So this is, I love this thing, you guys. I can't even tell you how much I love it. So this is what I use to try and make sure that we make decisions quickly. So anytime there's a question, like should we add feature X to the next release, I add it here. There's a status, the person who's requesting the decision maker, priority. All of these are pretty self-explanatory. Discussion location, I added this recently because often people would come to the decision log, see that a decision had been made, and want to understand what the factors went into making the decision, and so they'll want a link to the historical location. The decision with rationale, decision closing. Okay, so this is all particularly. So my favorite thing about this, though, you guys, is so I wrote a script here, which I have to fix because it's broken, which will allow you to have the spreadsheet automatically email an email list with a report on what are the open decisions and what have been closed recently, and how many days it's been since the longest open decision was opened. This has greatly increased my ability to get decisions made, especially sort of medium-sized decisions. Big ones, everyone will go to a meeting for. Little ones, they get made decision quickly because it's generally 2 people talking and deciding what it is they want to do. But sort of the medium-sized ones, which are hard to really push through quickly and tend to bog everything down like you would not believe. So this email, I don't have an example of the email, but it basically just every day, as long as there's an open decision, the email goes out saying, summarizing what it is that needs to be done and who it is that's supposed to be making the decision. And with enough days of decisions remaining open, generally I'll start embarrassing people by responding all to the email and being like, hey, we really need to get this decided by X date, otherwise it's going to have a negative impact on our schedule. So tips and tricks, you learned it here. Some thoughts about process. So you're going to annoy people. As the process person, this is unavoidable. I'm sorry about this. If you're a people pleaser, you might want to consider a different profession. I am actually a people pleaser, and it bugs me when I annoy people, but it is, I've come to realize, part of the job. That being said, I try and make sure that I adopt the minimum amount of process necessary in order to make things function. Things that will mean that you have to add process. If you have a distributed team, the more management stakeholders get involved, the longer the requirements are allowed to shift. All of this results in more overhead, more decisions need to be made, and more time spent in emails and in meetings, and that's unavoidable. I think being transparent about before needing to add process, if you can see like, oh, if you allow things to change after the design process is over, we're going to need process for figuring out how to incorporate those decisions into the schedule, will make people accept process better. The other thing I'll say is generally I wait till somebody else suggests a new piece of process before I like jump on board and get excited about it. So after every phase of our project, we generally have a retrospective where we go around and we talk about all of the things went wrong and why they went wrong, and all the things went right and why they went right. And generally in the all of the things that went wrong process, or piece of our discussion, there tends to be somebody who's like, oh, you know, having a regular meeting between the front end and back end teams would have meant that this didn't happen. If I think the team's grown to the point where we need regular meetings about that something, or if I think that's the only way of solving that problem, I tend to recruit that person to be a champion for adding that process. Other things, you'll write a lot of email. If you don't use TLDR or some sort of like top line kind of thing, people will love you if you do it. So a TLDR is too long, didn't read. It's generally a 2-sentence summary of the rest of your email. It allows people to open the email, determine whether or not they need to pay attention to it, and close it if they don't. People will love you if you do this well. I highly recommend figuring out how to write concise, good emails. A lot of times, if somebody sends email describing a complicated technical decision or something like that, that I find to be very concise and easy to read, I'll save it and actually go back sometimes and review, especially if I'm writing a tricky email, I'll review examples of emails people have sent me in the past that I thought were really good, to remind myself of the way to structure email and to make it easy for everybody to understand. The other thing I'll talk about is meetings. Everybody hates meetings. That's okay. Some rules I have for meetings: always have an agenda, always send an agenda out ahead of time. I always send out notes. So I know this is gonna be really controversial, especially with the Tech Lady Mafia crowd, but I always take notes. Even if I'm the most senior person in the room. And the reason that I take notes is because I want to control a couple of things coming out of that meeting. I want to make sure that all the decisions that were made in that meeting are documented well. I want to make sure that all of the action items that need to be assigned to somebody else get assigned. And I want to make sure that the sort of message gets framed in the way that I think is most helpful. So I find it to be a very powerful place to be writing notes, and I am always the one who does it. At the very least, you should make sure that somebody else is taking notes and they get sent out afterwards. The other thing to sort of just be careful about is people get frustrated with meetings when there are regularly meetings that happen where what it is you're trying to get done in the meeting is mismatched with the type of meeting you're convening. At Google, Larry has 4 rules for meetings. He says that every meeting must have one clear decision maker. If there's no decision maker, then a decision can't be made and the meeting shouldn't happen. That rule gets broken a lot. Oftentimes we'll have working meetings, or there'll be more than one decision maker, and people are coming to a consensus. It's not quite as clear cut as that, but I do think it's good to keep in mind as you're walking in, what is the decision that needs to be made and who is the decision maker. He says no more than 10 people should attend a meeting. Every person should give input. So if you have people who are sitting in meetings not saying anything, then they shouldn't be there. And no decision should ever wait for a meeting. If a meeting has to happen before a decision to be made, then the meeting should be scheduled immediately. That requires people to have very flexible calendars. That works at Google, it might not work elsewhere. So thinking about timelines, you guys probably have heard the scope, cost, time constraints. You can do 2 out of the 3. So if you've got unlimited amounts of money, you can probably keep the scope the same and keep the time, or increase the scope and still hit things on time. If you have a really small scope, then it shouldn't cost very much and shouldn't take too long. If you have a long time, you can keep things cheap and still do a lot. Those are sort of 3 things that I talk about a lot. So as features get added, this is really what happens. Product manager gets excited about a new idea, comes to the team and says, hey, let's do, in addition to doing X, Y, and Z, I also want to do A, B, and C. Then we have to have a conversation that's like, okay, are you going to find me more engineers, or cost, headcount, or are we going to launch late? Because you got to do one of those 2 things, or you've got to cut scope. So I talk about this triangle a lot when we're running into situations where people want to change what it is that we're doing midstream. The other thing that's very, very helpful is priorities. I've never seen project plans that match exactly scope, cost, and time. It's really hard to do at the beginning. So one of the things that will help you figure this out is by doing priorities. This can get described in a number of different ways. MVP, what's your minimum viable product? Like what has to ship? P0s, P1s, and P2s are the typical ways of people describing this. Priority 0, 1, 2, and 3. In my most recent job, both of these, like generally what happens is I'll be like, what's the MVP? And someone will come back and be like, all of this is the MVP. Like, all of it, really? And they're like, yes, all of it. And I'm like, okay, what's the P0 then? And they'll walk back and they'll come back and be like, everything is a P0. And I'll be like, okay, then tell me what happens first versus what happens last. And that's a really good way of getting folks to start thinking about what their priorities really are, because it's not true that everything is a P0. We've talked about the project tracker tricks. Actually, I think this is a simpler version of that original one. Yeah, this is a simpler version in case you want one that's not quite as complicated as the original one I showed you. Holding regular team meetings. There's a lot of different ways of doing this. I'll recommend some further reading later on if you want to get into like how to conduct stand-ups and all of that. I continue to conduct one-on-ones with all team members. If I can't meet with all team members, I'm at least meeting with the TLs and the product managers once a week. And then I spend a lot of time communicating out, so sending regular updates to management, again, updating the Google Sites page. So this is the scope creep problem. This is what happens. So I think mainly my job these days is to be the master of no. I think of all the documentation that I create as giving either me or others the power of saying no. So if somebody comes along and says, hey, you guys have to launch in Swahili as well as your regular languages, we can say, well, look at our timeline. If we add Swahili to their timeline, then it means we're not going to launch on time. Or, you know, if you want to give us an engineer who is like only going to be working on this, we could potentially live on time, but like that's an increase in headcount that you didn't give us at the beginning of the year. Some of the ways that I keep in mind of thinking about how to say no. No, this doesn't fit our priorities. No, we don't have time. No, we can't do this unless you make something impossible happen. No, we're going to do that in the next release. And then there's, of course, there's no, never, ever, really, we're not going to do that. I sort of keep these in mind. I actually have a Post-it note with those on my screen. And I spend a lot of time shielding engineers from increase in scope. I think a lot about being a prioritization machine. It's important to communicate and over-communicate about the risks of any meddling. I check in informally, I set up regular meetings, I send out reports. I think a lot about when other people are getting faced with hard decisions, I try really hard to use our documentation to arm them with what it is that they need to do, providing context, and explaining deadlines and all of that. So last thing, finishing the project. So you're gonna launch. There's generally some sort of review or retrospective. You wanna record the results and then archive things and celebrate. Launching is pretty self-explanatory, I hope. You're gonna do the thing that you set out to do. Wrap-up meetings. There's a book I'll recommend to you guys. It's specifically about retrospectives. I guess that should be under here. I can't edit this. I was going to take the slide while I was presenting. I can't do that. Anyway, wrap-up meetings can be retrospectives, but it's important to get everybody back together again to think about what went wrong, what went right, and how you're going to improve in the future. You can write up a closeout report. This is my template. Again, it's a pretty basic one. You can improve on it, but some things to be thinking about. Thank people. I keep a list of all of the people who've helped me along the way, and I write thank you notes and I send flowers and chocolates. And doing that keeps a lot of people happy with me, and it means that I'm able to be more effective in the future. You want to celebrate. Often this is not a step that gets overlooked, but if it is, be sure to make that there's like a meal or drinks or cookies or something, so everybody feels like their contribution is recognized and they get a chance to feel like a job done is a job well done. And then communicating out. So I write out a wrap-up email talking about what it is that we did, highlighting key metrics, explaining what it is that's going to happen and moving forward. And then generally there's a report that we publish that explains in detail how whatever it is that we did impacted sort of the OKRs that we created at the beginning of the project. So here's additional reading. I'm going to edit this before I send out an email to you guys, but the #1 book I recommend is Making Things Happen by Scott Berkun. It's great. Some of these other things are good too. This is me. I'm on Twitter. Feel free to email me or tweet me or anything if you have questions. I wish I could open it up at this point, but I don't think I can. So it was lovely presenting to all of you. I wish I could see your faces so I could smile and wave, but oh, I guess I can do this. What if I do this? Yeah, so you can see me. Hi, hope all of you enjoyed this. Please email me if you have thoughts, comments, questions, concerns. Also, even an I liked this would be great because I have no idea. I have no feedback, so I don't know how it went, but hope you're well, and I will see you guys around.